postponing that until the next meeting is perfectly fine. We have more than enough to do on parenting time.
Well, and I think so. And Dr. Venohr always feels so rushed because there's so much to address, and we limited her to an hour and then have her talk about something else for an hour that Judge Palmer's not even going to hear. To me, that just is not the best use of time, but I'm open to anything anybody else has to say on the subject, because there are probably some folks on here that have worked a lot on the low income deviation issue that know a lot about it and are interested in hearing about it today that I'm not aware of. I know it's not just Judge Palmer, but well, can I move then to let's start talking about parenting time first, after y'all address your any other minutes or anything you need to address, and then we'll just see how far we get with that before we go to low income deviation.
That's fine. We are not yet at quorum. We are sitting as usual at just one under. We're at 7. So I think it's fine to just move it. Hopefully we'll get somebody else to join us and just move on to the heart of the matter with Dr. Venohr.
Okay.
So are you ready for me, or do you want to do
I'm
another?
ready. I'm ready. Let's talk about parenting time, Dr. Venohr.
Okay.
Judge Williford, I'm sorry, just a point of order here. If we do get another member to join, can we momentarily stop to do our quorum verification and then vote on the minutes?
Yes, because then Mara will have to hop off, or somebody else will have to leave.
Byron does as well.
Down to not have a quorum again. So if we get quorum, please interrupt us and let us know that we have quorum so we can do a temporary pause and vote on the minutes.
Okay, thank you very much.
All right. And do y'all need to go over any rules or explain business before we get started? I'm sorry, I kind of jumped in.
LaTonna, did you just, I think we're all familiar with what we do each time, but do you have anything you want to add?
No, I mean, I'm fine if you want to go ahead and just jump into the subject.
Okay.
All right, Dr. Venohr, you're on.
Okay, well, thank you all for your public service. And I know you all are very busy and have enormous responsibilities. So really appreciate it. And I think this is really important issue, both of these issues, and a lot of states have been wrestling with it. And I know both of these memorandums are very dense, and they're really geared at, because you all are so busy, just really going to the meat of it. And I worked with Alabama the last couple of years on both of these issues. And I will say that I would say for both of these materials, it probably takes about 3 times to meetings just to digest. And where I'm coming from is I come from consulting in other states and seeing where adjustments work, what sort of issues that they have, how much does it align with the economics. But at the end of the day, you all are, Georgia, that's why you're on this subcommittee. And, so I hope this is interactive. I'm going to share with you what I know. And, but at the end of the day, what works best for Georgia. And and each of you brings such unique background that, stop me and interrupt and say, well, yeah, that might work for Alabama or another state, but certainly not us because of XYZ. So the first memorandum, or the one on the time sharing one, I'm going to go through the sub issues. I'm just going to do an overview because this what was in our contract. So this is obviously the issues that you're thinking. And I'm going to just do an overview first. And I'm going to pause now and then. I'm going to mainly take up, we got more assignments in this contract than we usually do. Usually it's a little bit more general. So I'm going to give you an overview of that. And then I'm going to plunge into the different types of parenting time adjustments. And that's where it takes a little bit slower to digest. And I'm probably not going to go into some of these detailed questions as much as you want, but we can pause. I think the hardest part is deciding what sort of adjustment mechanism you want, which is the formula. So our first one.
And Jane, I'm
yeah,
sorry, this is probably a good place to stop for a second. I see Judge Colbert waiting, Latana. Would you promote her? And if it would be okay, we could go ahead and get those minutes handled.
Be over
Sure.
there already.
There we go. Judge Colbert, welcome. And Noel, does that bring us to quorum? Okay, perfect. Katie or Judge Williford, do you want to cover the minutes?
So the minutes from the February 24th meeting have been distributed. Hopefully everyone got a chance to look at them. Do we have any edits? Okay. Can I get a motion to approve the minutes?
So moved.
Great. Can we get,
Second.
thank you. Can we get a vote on that? Let's say if you do not approve the minutes, you'll put it in the chat. Your silence will be taken as an aye vote to approving the February 24th minutes. Okay, so I'll let staff look for any objections. I don't think we're going to get any, and otherwise we'll consider the minutes approved now that we have quorum. So thank you, everyone. And I think that was the only thing we needed to vote on in this minute. So we can turn it back over to Dr. Venohr to start with item number 1.
Thank you, Jane. Thank you, Katie.
Well, thanks. Great. That was quick. So item number 1 is contractor will identify the main methods used by other states to account for parenting time when calculating child support. And there's over a dozen methods, and we've tried to categorize them later in this memorandum. So if we have time, we're going to go through each of those methods or how we've categorization in more detail. Number 2 is contractor will give a recommendation as to the simplest method to account for parenting time and child support calculations. Well, the simplest formula I can tell you right off the hat is using a percentage adjustment. And there was one earlier. At one time, Elaine sent me what was used. I can't remember what years those were used. And that is simple. It doesn't really match how parenting expenses are shared or to our knowledge. And it results in usually some cliff effects when, by cliff effect, there's a precipitous increase or decrease when you meet a time sharing threshold. Elaine, do you want to add anything about that previous formula, which was a simple percentage?
Yeah, and I think everybody's pretty much aware. She's talking about our Schedule C that was never passed into law. It was removed at the end of, during legislative session of 2006, it was removed, Jane, so we never used it. But we wanted you to see it so you would be familiar with what had been proposed in HB 221, and that you would be aware that we had made an effort towards something in the past that didn't get utilized.
Right, and it's a very simple. Kentucky's and Arizona's are very similar, so we'll pause and look at those later, but we're not a big fan of them because of those. It makes it lumpy. It creates a staircase, which you'll see in one of these graphs, but it's the simplest to use, and you can do a calculation manually. The third thing was the contractor will provide recommendation what is the most appropriate method for Georgia to consider to account for parenting time, and that's really you. We can talk about appropriateness for Georgia, ease of use, how understandable it is to guidelines users, perceptions of fairness, transparency. I was working with one state the other day, and they didn't want a formula that just went into a black box. They thought it was really important to have something out there that people understood the math behind, because the truth is that Georgia has a wonderful calculator, and you can automated calculator, and you can plug any sort of formula in there, but will parents understand what the adjustment is about? And sometimes that's important. If it really is you all that at the end of the day, how transparent do you want that formula to be? Another consideration is trends in parenting time. We know that families have gotten more complicated, and we can't even contemplate the sort of arrangements that they're making to care for their children. And this is really challenging for Georgia because your guidelines are legislative. And so it's a heavy lift to make changes. And, I assume that when you do make changes, you want something that's going to be viable for a while. And that's another thing that I'm so glad that this is done by subcommittee, and there's a lot of thought because all of you have such enormous experiences to bring in to know what would work best. Within that, number 3, the contract will provide recommendations accounting for parent time cases with various levels, with 1 to 49% up to equal. And I will tell you from the experiences of working with other states that it's better to have one formula that works for a wide range. And usually there's a few states out there that have 2 formulas. Iowa is a state that has 2 formulas. They have a sliding scale, like what was proposed in Georgia, and then they have the cross credit, which is the formula that is used by most states. A cross credit simply calculates a theoretical order for one parent, theoretical order for another parent, and then offsets it. And they use that for equal time sharing. Missouri, what they do is they have a sliding scale, sort of like what was proposed in Georgia. You hit equal, it goes to deviation factor. And then Minnesota at one time had 2 formulas for lower time sharing. They had a simple percentage, and then it went to this kind of cross credit at equal. And they realized it created a cliff effect, a precipitous drop right when the parents got to equal custody. And so they had to go back to their legislature and come up with a formula that worked for all time sharing arrangements. So that's just something to consider. You certainly can do a 2-tier system, but it's very tricky to figure out where you're going to put those different formulas and make it work. And then the third point here is that we're supposed to account for parenting time and split parenting time cases. And I rather get the shared parenting or the equal custody one. And I know that I need to be careful with that term. And I forgot to study up. Elaine was telling me that there was different definitions for equal and 50-50. And Elaine, do you want to help clarify me on that?
Okay. And LaTonna, since I'm speaking, would you let Judge Raymond in, please? Okay, thank you. Okay, so the 50-50, what I had explained
Elaine,
to
may I
you.
just cut you off for a second?
Sure.
Because you brought up Judge Raymond. I've been trying to promote him to panelist, and he's not accepting the invitation. Also, we cannot chat attendees. So I was trying to prompt him to do that. But so if he wants to be able to speak, we're trying to allow him to do that. It's going to cause a pop-up on his screen that he'll have to affirmatively accept.
Judge Williford, can you let him know that? Because he'll look at your email and answer would be my thought. Okay, so what Jane was talking about was I was making sure she understood that what we're dealing with is parenting time that might be anything from 1 to 49% of the time, or 50-50. It could be something higher than that, that we have our joint legal custody, also known as shared parenting, also known as 50-50. And we have our split parenting, that requires our 2 worksheets, so that we have those different things we have to consider. Jane, is that what you were?
Yes.
Yeah.
And I have to be really careful because Georgia uses slightly different terminology than other states. So when I talk about equal custody, I'm talking about equal physical custody when I say 50-50.
Right.
And when I talk about these formulas, I'm talking about the physical custody. So that's just something to keep in mind, and stop me if I'm not using the right terminology and confusing people. So,
Okay.
And with split, I would say that what some states do, and this is why I want to pause, is that there's those complicated situations where there has to be at least 2 children for this to happen. So there's split custody, and there's also shared physical. Like it might be the teenager. I mean, you probably had this happen where they're a teenager that doesn't get along with one parent. And so they might be sole with one parent, and then there's another child that is equal custody. equal physical custody. So in some of and the most common practice in other states is just to average the time sharing arrangement. So if we had, 100% of the teenager with one parent and then 50-50 with the other parent, that would be 75% used in the shared physical custody equation. But I'd like to revisit that, because I think first we got to make sure you get the right formula that would work for Georgia for shared physical custody. And then I think we can look at the split and whether the math works. And I will say that I would probably like for you all to get away from, or Georgia to get away from using the two worksheet. I mean, using the two worksheet, but just having one order. I think that there's some complications with that, but that's a little nuance that we can deal with later. I think the heavy lift is what formula to use for the physical custody. But that's just a quick answer to that thing. So number 4 is when considering the most appropriate way for Georgia to account for parenting time contract, we'll note that not all parents have been granted court-ordered parenting time. Contractors shall be aware of Georgia's legitimation statute, and when making the recommendation and recognizing that you have a high percentage of out of wedlock births. And I will say that our organization is we do a lot with out of wedlock births, and we've done a lot of work on helping states develop roadmaps for those that have never been married and how to get parenting time. And we certainly recognize that that's a huge, huge issue. But I will say that the issues I truly believe are separate. And I think it's that child support guidelines, it's okay. And a lot of states do require court-ordered parenting time before that adjustment is made. And I think it's a heavy lift to go ahead and say there are states that do it, that say we're going to do the actual parenting time. But I will tell you that in those states, Arizona, California, West Virginia, Michigan, Colorado are states like that. And in California, when I talk to the family law masters that are the ones that are working with the parents before they go to court, they say it's probably a really big, difficult issue for them to deal with. And California's formula starts at 1 overnight. So in other states that are just have adopted a time sharing a formula recently, for example, Alabama, Illinois recently adopted one in 2017. There's been a couple other states. They have gone with court order time sharing. And that, is a parenting plan. It could be agreement by the parties too. Also, it just depends on the language. And I would highly encourage that as a good starting point. I mean, it separates the guidelines issue from the parenting time. And I do feel bad for saying that, but I also think that, there's a lot of caseworkers out there, and that's a big, heavy lift to ask them to do it, especially, given Georgia's process. I don't know if anybody wants to comment about that. I'm going to pause there because that's pretty big.
No, I agree. I think that's the only way it can be done. I think this topic came up originally when we were talking about whether or not we could change the actual table, and you couldn't do that because you couldn't assume some sort of standard parenting time or something in the table, because there were all of these parents out there that don't even have legal, rights to their child because of our unique legitimation statute in Georgia. So I agree that it would be, and in my understanding, Byron or someone may be able to speak to this, but my understanding is that there's just no way that the department, the child support office, could address parenting time, sit here and try to figure this out, like whether they agreed to it or didn't agree to it, what the parenting time was they just don't have the manpower to deal with that. So I think it would have to be, I think that it would have to be a court-ordered parenting time situation that you would be looking at before you could determine the deviation or the adjustment, whichever one we're going to call it.
Right, and it's not only just the manpower or staff power, but the having the knowledge of what's going on, or it's a serious thing. I mean, Georgia is fortunate to have the domestic violence grant and one of the Save Center, and I think there's going to be a lot of things learned from that. And we did have a conversation about that. I think it was with the subgroup. So, I mean, it's really important. I mean, we all know from the data and the research that both parents involved with the children is very, very important, but it's just beyond the scope of the guidelines to fix that. And hopefully, there'll be some stuff that comes out of the the SAVES grant that helps Georgia find a good roadmap for those never married parents to get on board, to get some sort of involvement with both parents, and probably a court ordered, So thank you though for the input, Judge Williford. That's just it's a tough issue, and but you can't fix everything through the guidelines.
Right. Very true.
So number 5 is, if the unit of time is needed to count for parenting time, what unit of time should be used? And I put some examples in here on page 17, and this is a little bit dated. I should probably update it, but the short of it is that we certainly recommend some sort of definition. I'm going to pause there. Does Katie want to add something? For a minute.
No, she's shaking her head no.
Okay, good. So with the unit of parenting time, I think probably the most important thing is to allow some sort of flexibility, because, as we know that these parents come up with schedules that we never contemplated. They work different hours, and, there's some states that trust leave it to court discretion to come up with some common sense. And there's other states that micromanage it in their guidelines, down to the 4-hour block. And so there's some examples in here just to get you thinking about what would work best for Georgia. But certainly, we can talk about that later when we get there. 6 is, contractor will provide a recommendation as to whether Georgia should continue to account for parenting time as a deviation, and whether Georgia should amend its child support guidelines statute to account for parenting time as an adjustment. And where I really hope that Georgia comes up with a formula for both parenting time and the low income adjustment. And I think that our experience in other states is that these formulas are very essential for consistency and predictability for the parents. The parents, they want to know too. And it's something that it's important to know that their state does consider and recognize both parents, and recognizes that it costs money to have the child in both homes. So that's a really important message to send. As far as whether there are states that include a parenting time adjustment as a deviation factor in their a formula within their deviation factor, and they say you use it. If you're going to deviate, use it. Florida is a case in point, so is South Carolina. And I put both of those provisions. I think I put both of these provisions in here. It's been a few days since I looked at this, and I thought Alabama kept theirs as a deviation, and they said they were going to. And then I was looking at it the other day, and I thought it's not a deviation. Alabama just adopted theirs, and it is a presumptive formula. So, but in short, you can have a deviation that you have court discretion. Then it says, okay, we're going to make this we're going to deviate for this case, and then we're going to use this formula. So that gives that predictability and consistency across the state, which are the major things that are lacking right now. And then, but you can still have that deviation. With the low income adjustment, I will say that I would rather see Georgia go presumptive with that, rather than keeping the low income adjustment formula as a deviation, or having it as a deviation. And the difference between why I say that for the low income formula versus the shared parenting formula is the low income formula is a federal requirement. And so by making it a presumptive formula, then I figure my perspective, but it's at the end of the day, it's the federal perspective that matters, is that makes it clear that Georgia is abiding by that federal requirement. And also lower income folks have less access to attorneys. So they're less likely to be able to implement that deviation criteria, which is a problem for the shared, if you do make the deviation, the shared parenting formula deviation, then it's going to be more likely to be used by higher income families that can afford an attorney and know about the deviation and can make it happen. So that's just a limitation. You know, at the end of the day, I think that's a huge policy decision that, you know, is in Georgia's thing. And we can certainly talk about more of the pros and cons. And I think it probably will matter what the formula is, as far as whether, you know, you want to make it a deviation or make it a presumptive formula. So I think that's a thing that I would recommend you circle back on once you find what formula you feel works the best. Number 7 is kind of the same issue. You know, I think where it really depends on the formula. 8 is the definitions of custodial parent and non-custodial parent. And that's another one that I think we need to circle back on, that we'll have to look at what formula you land on, and then look at the language in your guidelines so you don't have to change everything up, or, this is, in this day and age, that terminology is just difficult. You know, there's some states use parent A, parent B, paying parent, and there's no perfect. I mean, in this day and age, I don't think there's a perfect solution, but I'll bring you some language from other states, and we have to think of how congruent it works with whatever formula you decide to go with, if you decide to go with a formula, and the rest of your existing guidelines. So that's something I want to circle back to. So number 9 is there is no formula to determine the amount of parenting time deviation in Georgia's. And this is a bunch of different formulas that were thrown out in the contract. And one is what I call a daily rate for over 90 days. I'm not a big fan of these per diem rates, because that's not how family budgeting occurs. You know, when there's rent, it's not a per day thing, it's a monthly thing or a mortgage payment. So, but there's still a lot of states that use it, and there's Pennsylvania and Utah. The Tennessee one is a version of it. There also can be very complicated. If you look at the Tennessee version, which I pasted in the memorandum, I pasted it on the last page of the memorandum, page 19. You can look at the math of it, and it's kind of like, how did they come up with 0.0109589 as their adjustment? And that comes up with a per diem rate. So you certainly can go there. But I will say that most of your neighboring states use that cross-coded approach that I discussed earlier. So it's not a closed door if you're attached to it. Method 2 is sort of like that cross credit that I talked about, is that the non-custodial parent pays the difference in each parent's order. Should be singular, I have it as, but it's really an offset, and it doesn't account for the fact that it costs more to raise a child in 2 households than one. And when I describe that simple cross credit to you, I failed to mention that there's another step that every state except maybe one doesn't include, where they raise that basic obligation of how much it costs to raise a child in one household, which is the amount in your table. That's how much it costs to raise a child in one household. And that they raise it by usually 1.5%, because it costs about 50% more to raise a child in two households than it does for one child. And actually, the most recent data that we've been looking at says that it's even higher. It's closer to 60 to 70% more. In fact, that's the reason that West Virginia legislature just voted to increase their multiplier to 1.6. And that passed in legislation. And I think the effective date is July 1, 2023 this year for West Virginia. So I'm not really a big fan of the second method either. The third method is also a per diem amount. And again,
Can I interrupt for just a second
Sure.
again about that second one? Also just want to zoom us out and give it orient us. Elaine and I threw those examples into the contract to get over the initial hurdle of folks saying, it's fine, everything's fine, there's no need to fix anything, everything's working as is. These are real life examples that we've gotten from judges to show the disparate nature of what with the lack of guidance in the statute, folks have to do something. So they come up with their own thing. And this is what's being done, and it's fine. But I thought that it would help show even the need for legislative change, A. Now, as to the second formula that folks use out there, one of my biggest issues with simply netting out the final child support amount, which you'll hear a lot of people tell people to do, and oh, this is what we do. That's at the wrong point in the calculation, as far as I'm concerned. Really, all we're talking about is reapportioning the BCSO amounts. So I just want to get clarity for myself. Am I wrong on that? Because for me, if you just net out the final child support amount, everything after the BCSO, we know what those amounts are. We know who's paying what. We make them put that in the calculator. So if you net out the final amount, you're giving a parenting time deviation, or you're adjusting for parenting time on things about like who paid the extracurriculars, or I don't know, all the what we would call Schedule D, childcare and health insurance. That's suddenly getting thrown in the parenting time mix, and everything on Schedule E. So all we're talking about here is how to reallocate at the BCSO level is what my understanding after, thinking about this for years now. And I just want clarity from you. Is that what you think a parenting time adjustment should do?
No, I don't. I thought it was netting out at the BCO level, not those other expenses, which would be really, really bad. I thought it was bad enough to do the BCSO to net that out, because all that is doing is it doesn't account for that basic obligation is how much it costs to raise a child in one household. So all that's being netted out is that each parent's share for that one household. It's not accounting for now the paying parent has food expenses and other expenses, and it really doesn't do anything. That's not a good adjustment.
Right, a good adjustment definitely should not net out the final child support amount. And you're saying it's not even a great idea to net out the BCSO amount, but that would be better than netting out the entire our famous line 13, the final child support amount.
Yeah, the line 13 is much more egregious than the BCSO netting, but the BCSO netting is egregious too. Yeah, it's not consistent with how parenting time expenses are incurred by both parents. Any other questions? I haven't been looking at the chat. I'm assuming somebody's monitoring the chat.
Yes, Jane, we are.
Okay.
Okay, sorry.
Oh, no, I think that's important. I mean, and Noelle, I really appreciate your point that it's just illustrates the inconsistent application and also the predictability. I mean, Georgia's guidelines are pretty easy to read compared to other states. I mean, I don't want to say that I know there are parents on this call and I don't want them to think that, if they hear something that I don't want to say that they're totally, still a legal document, but they are easier than a lot of other states. So, and there's a lot of pro se parents too, so just to know that they're getting an adjustment when that child's in both households. I mean, they're both involved parents. I mean, that both parents took the time to read the guidelines, or maybe the parent that's going to be the payee, and to try to, it's just out of respect to his or her time. And so the method 4, they actually had, I says 3 options, but it looks like there's 4 options. I guess the last 3 are the options. And then number 1 is just saying that there's no adjustment. And then the other ones are, some sort of per diem and splitting the difference between it. And then the last one I really just did not understand, but that's for illustrative purposes. I think Noelle just wanted to say these are the different types of adjustment. And certainly, I'm going to show you adjustments that are used in other states. And if you all want to circle back to any of these adjustments and try to flesh them out or put some parameters in there, I'll go there with you. And I'll say that with any of the adjustments that we go, that all these states, every single state takes their own little unique spin on it. And Georgia wants to take their unique own spin on something, for instance, use a 1.7 multiplier, which isn't used by any state, instead of a 1.5. If you were going to go down that road of the cross credit, I'll go down there with you, but at this point, we're just doing an overview, and hopefully as we talk, you can say, well, that formula will never work for Georgia, and that formula, let's look at it some more. And that doesn't mean, as we move on, you can say, well, let's go back to that one formula. This is more just, I want to get to the point where you narrow it down to a few formulas that you like or dislike. And then we can all circle back and go back to some of these other formulas. So on 10, this is so unfortunate. I mean, I would have loved to evaluate the case file data more, but we didn't get time sharing arrangements, so I will say that what we're seeing in other states, and this is where I really appreciate the ground experience, is that we see that parenting time arrangements are usually lumpy, that I would say that probably close to 40% land in close to equal, and maybe even higher, right at 50-50. That's a very common. And then another place where they land is closer to, like, I would say 92 to about 120 overnights. And I didn't bring all my numbers with me. Usually I have them, but that's usually something like every other weekend. And then like on Wednesday nights, and then every other holiday. And some of the attorneys, and you'll have to talk among yourself and see if this is true. Some of the attorneys that I've talked to in several other states say, don't even worry about counting those every other weekends, because every other holidays, because they usually fall on weekends. So, then it ends up being fleshed out or kind of balancing each other out because of that every other weekend. So I will say that when you start thinking about, when we get down to some of the meats of some of these formulas, and when you start thinking about them, sometimes it's easy to get stuck on, well, what if they have 50 nights versus 52 overnights? And, really think about your caseload and what you're seeing, and where, if they are lumpy, concentrated by almost equal, and then right around that 82 to 120 overnights, which is roughly every other weekend with Wednesdays and then some holidays. So, but we'll certainly do a lot of case examples when we get to that point. And that's good because like I say, you might be going one direction, then you start seeing some case examples and you'll say, oh, let's circle back and look at something that we already looked at. Contractor will review the public comments collected by and providing the contractor by the Georgia Child Support Commission when evaluating methods. Thank you, Elaine, for sharing those. And I have been reading them. I think they're very consistent with what we see in other states. So I'll sprinkle that in when as I talk about different type of adjustment methods. Did you want to add something, Elaine?
No, we just appreciate you looking at those.
Yeah, I love looking at them. I just you know, I was surprised you didn't get as many comments as I was expecting, you know.
Well,
So,
and some of them were complaints that weren't about our guidelines at all.
which is typical.
Yeah.
Yeah. So contractor will consider DV issues when making recommendations. And this is consistent with the SAVES grant. And we are seeing, you know, we have some other states that we're working with, and there's 2 ways that we're seeing states address this. One is to, again, this emphasizes how important it is to require court order time sharing. That's, you know, in other states, there might be magistrates or referees, and they might not have the authority to enter a court order on time sharing. You know, I know Georgia is different. And sometimes the lower decision maker, or I don't want to say lower, but the one without authority, they're not necessarily trained or have the where the knowledge to deal with that issue. I mean, it's such an important issue that you know, we just can't take it lightly, those time sharing arrangements. And so that's another reason to leave it to somebody that has expertise in that area. I will say that there are some states in their child support guidelines, and I forgot to look to see if Georgia had it, that they put it right in their guidelines to require periodic sharing of income information and change of address. And it might be right in the court order for child support that, you know, every year or every 2 years, I know Arizona has this, that the parent party should share information, which makes sense, you know, in the sense that, well, that way, you know, if there's the parents would know if a modification is appropriate. And they'll know if the other parent's income, you know, increased or decreased. And Colorado has a similar provision, and they were just like going, uh-oh, they're a SAVES grant thing. And they said, you know, we realize that in DV cases, we probably shouldn't be requiring that. So they're working on making the link. Does anybody want to add anything before we start plunging into these formulas? Because this is where the headache begins, and it's almost 3 o'clock there.
I have a quick question, Dr. Venohr, about what you just said. So there are some states that have requirements for updated income information being exchanged at some periodic points. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, that they share income information. Arizona had that. I'm not sure. I should check Arizona's most recent guidelines to see if they took it out. Yeah.
Okay. I can only imagine how overwhelming it would be to our court system to end up with the flood of modifications that would come along with that, or just the posturing or, you know, ongoing litigation, or I don't know. That sounds very scary to me, but interesting.
Well, yeah, and I don't think, you know, I mean, putting it in somebody's order, but complying with it is another story. I mean, you know, how many I'm betting that parents don't always send their statements, their income statements, W-2s to each other, you know.
Right.
And then taking it to court to getting it enforced. I don't know if, you know, I'm betting that it doesn't happen. I mean, that often. I'll ask Arizona next time, but I just
So in that vein, are there any states that do any sort of like COLA adjustment or something like that? Like instead of setting them up for potential modifications, just acknowledging that, you know, inflation happens, and regardless at what rate, it is still always sort of moving up.
Minnesota has a COLA adjustment that I think it's every 2 years, and they want to get rid of it. It's a nightmare. And New York has a COLA adjustment, and it will be interesting to see if it is used. I mean, their threshold was so high. I'm pretty sure it was 10% until this last 2 years. We just never had inflation of high enough inflation. Our inflation rate prior to this craziness was, like 2-3% in a given year. So this is new, and I think it's a huge concern. My organization has done a lot of research on streamlining the modification process. And what Minnesota has found is that because of the notification, I mean, this is pretty serious. This is serious stuff, is that, you're going to modify somebody's order based on a COLA adjustment. So you can imagine the notification that has to go out to both parties and the opportunity to contest it or appeal it. I'm not using the right legal term. And so there's a lot of that happening. And, it's just a nightmare with the notification process. And then, particularly for low income folks where they might not get the salary increases that warrant that sort of inflationary adjustment. So it is kind of, is it penalizing one income group over another income group? Yeah, I think if I recall though, Minnesota is now in the process of making movements to get rid of it. I thought it was statutory. So, yeah, I'll have to check on it, but I wouldn't recommend it. I mean, it is a catch-22, especially right now. I mean, I'm sorry, I'm going on a little bit longer just because it's an issue I'm struggling with mathematically on how to deal with this recent inflation. And I will say that the trends that we see in the research that we're doing is that the cases that request modifications are those ones that are paying cases, because if you're getting payment, you care. Or the obligated parents, if they're paying, they care too. So those that aren't paying, they're not getting that, they're not seeking a modification. And then what we see is that for the receiving party, if they're less likely to seek a modification because they don't want to rock the boat, and they've told us that in surveys. So even though he or she may be paying and they know that there's been a salary or wage increase, they might not do it. So that's the kind of the catch-22. I'm going to stop there because I'm going off on a different topic. Anybody want to add anything to that?
I just checked with a dear friend in Minnesota. They have a every 2 years COLA adjustment.
Yeah, so they're not getting rid of it.
New York does that as well. New York does a COLA as well.
Yeah, New York, you have to, I think it's a 10% threshold. They don't usually use it. They don't implement it. New York, Minnesota does implement it. It's presumptive, where New York is more limited. So, but they might have met the threshold with the recent inflation. I can't remember if it's 10% in 1 year or 10% over so many years. So do you want to add anything? Elaine's doing some research on the side here. So she's on it.
I'm looking at Judge Williford.
Up-to-date information.
Judge Williford needs to step aside for just a moment.
Okay.
No, it doesn't have to be right now. I just want you to know
Okay.
that I need to talk to you about it.
Okay.
So yeah, if we can, let's move into the types of formulas and help us understand those, because I'm not sure we have a whole group that worked on this for a long time who understand this a lot more than I do, but I'm not even sure that I still understand what the cross credit approach, how that works, or these other approaches.
Sure. Okay, so we're moving on to page 4 of the memorandum. And I looked at this from a report from Ohio recently. So if there's some information that is a little off, it was because I didn't edit it well enough. Ohio has a parenting time adjustment right now, and they use annual income. So those are some of the key differences if you see some sort of mistake. So this is our attempt to categorize states with their parenting time formula. And I obviously have a little math error here because I have states with, oh no, that's right. There's 43 states with a formula, and there's 8 states that do not. Those are Arkansas, and they just went to income shares a couple of years ago, and I worked with them, and they decided they wanted to keep it as a deviation criteria. It was a big leap, just like it was for Georgia, just to even start using both parents' income in the calculation. Connecticut, again, has a deviation. It's very similar to Georgia, and they are also talking about what they can do. I think Mississippi, they're based on a percentage of obligor income, and they just had legislation that failed to increase those percentages. They're the lowest guidelines in the country right now. And so I think that would be I don't think Mississippi's going to touch their deviation formula for, or deviation criteria for time sharing. New Hampshire wants to very badly get a parenting time formula, and they're working hard on trying to get it. New York, I've been told, will be the last state in the country to ever get a time sharing adjustment. And that has to do with their legislative judicial committee, I've been told. Texas, I don't know Texas. Washington, that's a tough state too. As I look at it, all these states have legislative guidelines, except for Arkansas, they're set in court rule. And Connecticut is kind of a mixture of administrative rule and court rule and legislature. And it's always more difficult to get through to the legislature. And one reason is that, you all have wonderful, like you say, as Judge Williford was saying, that you've been working on this for a long time, and you have this depth of understanding, and legislators are coming in at ground zero. So it's a lot of work to educate them. So you'll see that most states use the cost credit with a 1.5 multiplier. And I'm going to go through that calculation in a minute. There's a couple of states that have a no multiplier or an alternative multiplier. The states that have no multiplier with that cross credit are Montana and Nevada. Oklahoma has a sliding scale multiplier that makes no sense to me, but it is interesting. And again, that multiplier is to account for the fact that it costs about 50% more to raise a child in 2 households. And I didn't move West Virginia into that other bucket yet, where they're a cross credit with an alternative multiplier of 1.6. Virginia uses 1.4. And then offset is that simple thing that we talked about earlier, where they just take the difference. It makes no sense to me why they do that between each parent's basic obligation. That's how Rhode Island does it. North Dakota does that, but they're a percentage of obligor income state. So it's a little bit different than the math behind Rhode Island's, but Rhode Island does do that. And that sliding scale that we talked about, which was proposed in Georgia, there's all sorts of variations of it. And we're going to look at a few of them. Some of those states include Arizona, Delaware, Iowa, Kansas, Kentucky, Ohio, and Utah that use a sliding scale. Actually, Utah should be in that per diem bucket. Some days I move them around. It's very hard to put them in buckets. There's this
May I interrupt you for a second? We have a guest who's a representative from our from GCSS, like our 4D agency. She's raising her hand. Do you mind fielding a question from her?
Oh, glad. Thank you for noticing. Yeah. Hi, Erica. I haven't seen you for a long time.
Erica, unmute.
She wants to raise.
I wonder if she can't unmute.
Maybe she's not elevated to speaker or to participant.
Well, she is. But
Might have maybe stepped away or something, but.
I'll keep talking until Erica gets going. But so the other
Okay.
things is the consideration of transferred and fixed expenses. And conceptually, what this means is that we have some transferable expenses like food. You know, only one parent can pick up a meal at a time. And then assuming the child doesn't eat 2 meals. So I'm not talking about teens. And then, you know, housing is a duplicated expense because both households have to have expenses. So these states break down those type of expenses and design their formula around there. And then I'm going to talk about nonlinear formulas. And those are the most complicated mathematically and daunting mathematically when you look at them. And but what they accomplish is that they have this gradual decrease, or they start off with a little bit of decrease to account for that transferable expense of food, and then it gets to a larger increase when that time sharing is almost equal. And so there's some really merit. The results are really nice with those nonlinear formulas, but the math behind them is daunting. The per diem adjustments, Hawaii, Pennsylvania, North Dakota. North Dakota is one of those duality states where they use 2 types of formula. In Tennessee, and I already told you I'm not a big fan of those because, you know, like rent is not something at a per day rate. California and Massachusetts have these unique formulas. I can't recommend California's. It's embedded in their basic formula, and I think it's very mathematically complicated. You'd have to change throughout your whole table. Massachusetts is pretty complicated too. So those states with a formula are, there's 43, and then states without are 8. And yeah. Did Erica, was she able to join us for her question yet?
she noted that she was raised her hand in error. It was an accident.
Oh, is that what it was? Okay.
Okay. So this next table on page 5, this is interesting too, because it shows that question that was already raised in the contract. It was like, okay, do we have a formula for equal time sharing? That's physical custody. And then is there another formula, or do we have a continuous formula? And where does it start if we have a formula for a lower amount? And this is really interesting, is that we now have 8 states that have a formula that start like at 1 to 10% time sharing. And Arizona, they have a percentage of adjustment. So that's that sliding scale. California is too complicated. You'd have to change out your formula. Michigan, Minnesota, and Oregon are those nonlinear formulas where the math is really complicated, but they start with 1 to 10% time sharing. And then there's Missouri, Nevada, and New Jersey that do that. And a clear advantage at starting at very, very low levels of time sharing is that then you don't ever get any cliff effects. You know, I mentioned some earlier that there might be, you know, there's invariably somebody that goes, well, we went from 50 overnights to 52 overnights, and there was a big change with some of these formulas. So an advantage with starting it at very low is you're never going to have that happen, or you shouldn't, depending on the formula type, particularly if you went to a nonlinear. I question whether that's overkill, because as I say, what we're observing in other states is that parenting time arrangements that parents arrive at are pretty lumpy. They either go for equal or that every other weekend and every other holiday and Wednesday, and depending on what you consider a holiday, you know, that changes the math. Now, Indiana, they start theirs a little higher, and that's another state that has a very complicated formula, but I would say if there was a formula that mimicked how parents share expenses, Indiana is probably one of the best. David Betson, who does the economic data on child rearing expenditures, he derived it. And so we'll look at the Indiana formula. It's a complicated formula though, but it does account for that transferable, and it's very clear what they think is transferable and duplicated. Florida, which is a neighboring state, I guess they start theirs at 20%, if I remember correctly. It's in here. I put their provision in here. And one of the reasons I put their provision in here there's actually two reasons. It's the bordering state, and it's one of those formulas where it's a deviation, then it says, okay, the judge has decided to deviate. Now use this formula. And they use the cross credit with a 1.5 multiplier. I will say that the cross credit works best if you have a threshold of like about 25% to right around 25%. And when you have that multiplier, and I'll just say this, but I'm going to have to show you mathematically eventually, and I didn't do it in this one. And if you go there, is it blows up. It blows up for time sharing less than like 20 to 25%, depending on what the parent's income is. And that the reason it blows up, it doesn't work, is what I mean, is because that multiplier, which I very much mathematically favor because it does cost more to raise a child in two households. It blows up because when you get to that low level, you're increasing that basic obligation by 150%. So one parent's might have to pay a bigger share than he or she would with a sole custody order. But if you're not understanding that, just we'll go back to it. In case you do go down the road of the cross credit, though, we'll go back to that issue. But what that means is if you want a time sharing adjustment that works for very low levels of time, then you probably don't want to go with a cross credit. And if you also want a formula that doesn't work, that doesn't have a major cliff effect when you get to that time sharing formula, you probably don't want to go with a cross credit. With that said, the advantages of the cross credit are that it's very understandable because you're creating a theoretical order for each parent, and people get that I owe my partner, you know, I'm talking me, so I'm going to use that pronoun he. My partner owes an order. We're going to weigh it by the time the child's with each other parent, and then do sort of an offset. People really understand that, and the legislature gets that too. And they also get the concept that it costs more to raise a child in two households. So generally, our experience is when we talk about the cross credit with a multiplier, populations get it, and the legislature gets it, which is important, the transparency issues. With that said,
can I interrupt you? I'm sorry. You may be getting to this, and so I may be jumping ahead, but I don't even understand what you mean when you talk about cross credit with a multiplier. That's complete Korean to me. So I really need you to explain it to me on a fifth grade level. I mean, what does that mean? Cross credit with a multiplier, with a 1.5 multiplier means nothing to me. Are you getting to that, or do you just assume that
Let's jump to it, Judge Williford.
Okay. All right. Because I don't know. Again, I know that some folks have worked on this and understand that. That means nothing to me. I don't know what that means.
Right. Let's jump.
It's right there on the same page. So let's definitely go for it.
Yeah, let's go on page 6. Let's go into the calculation. So what this is, and I think I used Georgia numbers. Yeah, I did. So we have two parents, and I use the medium. I use close to their income. I think I use the median. I don't think I use the average. That was in your case file data for the time sharing arrangement. So again, thank you to Lane and the staff at AOC for getting that data. So this is pretty close to reality. So we have parent A, and I changed the labels, parent A to parent B. I know that's not what you use, but that's just neutral. So we have one parent that makes gross income of $3,100, another parent that makes a gross income of $4,300. Their combined income is $7,400. Parent A share is 42%, parent B share is 58%. And then we look at the schedule, there's just one child that, or the table of income shares table for Georgia. That amount would be $1,100 for parents making $7,400 in combined income. There was no adjustments to income. And then we, so if a sole custody, we would have 462 for parent A, parent B would be 638. So if we had no time sharing adjustment, parent B would owe parent A $638. And then what we do when we get to line 5, we're looking at the shared custody. And here is when we see that multiplier. It costs more to raise a child in 2 households than 1. We're using 1.5 because that's what most cross credit states do. You can use another one. Like I say, there's an argument to take that up to 1.7. Actually, there's data. Georgia, West Virginia took it to 1.6, but for this example, we're only going to increase it by 50%. That would be $1,650. Now, instead of prorating the basic obligation from the income shares table, we're going to prorate that shared basic obligation that was increased by 50%. So, you know, it costs more. So each parent's going to owe part of that increased cost. And so parent A would owe 693 of that increased shared obligation. And then parent B would owe 957. So that's the first step in the calculation. Then it's like, oh, wait a minute, we got to account for the overnights because parent B is going to incur expenses and parent A is going to incur expenses. So now what we do is we take the time sharing arrangement on line 7. So parent A, the lesser income parent, has the kid for 265 overnights. Parent B has the kid for 100 overnights per year. And then we convert that to a percentage on line 8. So parent A's the majority custody 73% of the time, and parent B is 27% of the time. So now we're going to say that parent A retains that amount of their share for 73% of the time. So we take that parent share of the combined obligation from line 6, they're going to retain it to take care of that kid when the kid's in their parent A's household. So we take 73 and times that by line 6, and that's 506 that they're going to retain. And we do the same for parent B. They're going to retain 258. So essentially they're going to get a credit for the cost for 258 per month for raising that kid when the kid's in the household roughly, well, it's 100 nights over a year. And then line 10, we look at the difference. So as parent A is going to retain 506, we take that away from that 693, and parent A is going to owe parent B 187 for their overnights. And then parent B is going to owe parent A 699 for their overnights. And then finally, we get to that concept of offsetting on line 11, where we take the higher amount and we subtract the lower amount, and the parent owing the higher amount is the obligated parent. So now parent B is going to owe parent A 512 a month for parenting time, and they would have owed parent A 638 if it was a sole custody arrangement. So the parent B essentially got an adjustment of $126 for that arrangement. How'd that feel?
That was an interesting journey.
Math
For
class.
me, Jane, a way I've come to think of it conceptually is when we're doing the calculations for the Schedule D expenses, like work-related childcare and insurance, and then any expenses on Schedule E, like our deviations. We go through it and we always say, when we're training, especially Elena and I say, and then we apply credit to the parent actually paying that expense. This is the way to do that for the BCSO expenses. For me, that's how I think of it.
Mhm.
That's
Right
good.
now, we're not giving them credit for any of those expenses that they may have because of their parenting time. It's seen as going all to this custodial parent based on their share, but it currently, unless you do some sort of parenting time deviation, you're not crediting them for those costs that they have when their child is with them. The cost estimated by the BCSO amount. So that's how I see that, what you just led us through. And I couldn't get there. I couldn't figure out how that should be done. But is that how you would possibly explain? Because what is going to happen is Elaine and I are going to have to explain this to other
Yeah,
people.
we'll have to train it. Yeah.
Like,
And I want to add to what Noelle is saying, Jane, if that's okay. I see this as like replacing our Schedule C, that was placed in a holding pattern forever and ever. But this would then be a visual calculation that parents could see as they're participating in asking, for that or seeking that parenting time adjustment. So this would be where they could actually see all these numbers tumbling out, and with training and explanations, instructions, they could hopefully very easily follow the math. So
Some
and
will
this is
be able
across
to and
correct.
some can't, unfortunately, it's.
The states that use this, I'm assuming the calculator really does all this for you. The only thing that's going to be different is you're going to put in the number of days for parent A, as you're calling it, the number of days for parent B, and there's going to be a way that the calculator does everything else. Now, I know that we like to understand, if we had to do it on paper and pencil,
Oh,
how
definitely.
this all happens, and I appreciate you explaining that. But for purposes of judges, lawyers, practitioners, self-represented litigants, everybody else, this is just going to be one additional step on the calculator, which is putting in the time, overnights, you call it, with each parent, or whatever we decide to call it, online, in your example, line 7, and then somehow the calculator is going to do everything else and spit out the
Right.
number.
Right. Correct. And I would probably recommend that you do a separate worksheet, and just so, or I should say a separate schedule, to use the Georgia term.
Yeah.
That would be our Schedule C.
Yeah.
Right.
And that way you don't have that calculation for all the sole custody cases, because it just, the math gets kind of confusing.
Right.
And I will say that some states have rejected this calculation because they think it's too complicated. Like Kentucky, it's like, no way, we're not doing this. We don't like it. We don't like the cliff effect. We don't like the complication. So they went with a sliding scale percentage. Alabama, they said we have to do it this way. I mean, it's just intuitive that you calculate in order for one parent and then the other parent, and it somehow gets offset. So there's all sorts of schools of thought. And since you border, like Alabama, Georgia, Florida, South Carolina, North Carolina, and Tennessee, 3 of those 5 states use this formula. So chances are along your borders, they're going to be more comfortable with the formula used by that state. Which, is an issue too. I see Pat put her picture up. So does that mean Pat has a question?
No. Shaking her head no.
I have a comment. I think that the actual formula, or being able to count the number of nights, is not that far of a reach, quite frankly, because I know that for a number of years, the child support addendum has a section where it says parenting time, and you're supposed to write in the non-custodial, the nights, the number of nights that the custodial and non-custodial. And some people fill it in that way, some people don't. And I always wondered, what happens to that information? Why did they want it? It was, because basically if it was never technically part of the worksheet, you're kind of trying to figure out why is this here? So I think doing it this way with the multiplier, I think it's not a far-fetched for people to count and say, okay, how many overnights? And then be able to now see that it is actually part of the formula and, can make a difference in, what happens with the number.
Well, I'll agree with you on that. And I think you're talking about the child support addendum. But I will say that my experience has been, because that didn't really mean anything, that people just ballparked it. Do you know what I'm saying?
Right.
But when it's going to matter dollar for dollar,
they'll count it next. Right.
People are going to start going, wait a minute. I'm not happy with you putting 265 and 100 right here, because before it didn't really
didn't matter.
Yeah. So when it is now tied to dollars, then there's going to have to be a real clear way, which to me is, we've got these 9 issues and they're all important issues, but the 2 main issues is how are we going to do it? In terms of what formula and what is the unit of time going to be? How are we going to count the unit of time? So if we decided, and I know this is only the first one we've looked at, but if we decided, okay, we're going to do the cross credit with a 1.5 or a 1.6 multiplier, fine. Then the second issue is going to be, how are we going to count it? And I'll agree that we're used to counting it, but we very much ballparked it because it really didn't mean anything for the most part.
And I think Dr. Venohr in the report later on, she talks about the different states on how they consider overnights. And I think she provided that report earlier. So we would, you're right. We would have to then figure that part out.
No, she did. And they're very interesting and quite laborious depending on which one you go with.
And all along the way, we have to keep in mind that we have to sell this to the legislature. They have to understand it. So I'm sorry, Jane.
So Judge Williford and Dr. Venohr, we have a question and or comment from Carol Walker, who was on our Parenting Time Study Committee.
Oh, excellent.
For years. So
that you guys did a lot of great work. Thank you on that.
Shall I promote her, Judge Williford? Do you want to allow Carol to ask a question? Yeah. Okay. Okay, Carol.
All right. Can you guys hear me?
Yes.
Hi, Carol.
All right. So there was a lot of discussion in the study committee, and certainly one of the recommendations, and forgive me, I'm sort of juggling a few things right here, but one of the recommendations was that we would perhaps use a formula that applied to the entire BCSO, but that is gradual, with a much smaller incremental adjustment to parents with very little parenting time and larger adjustments to parents with almost equal parenting time, exponential curve approach, which is the Minnesota approach. But from what I'm hearing from Dr. Venohr, and I don't have the benefit of the paper that you all are referring to in front of me. But I guess my question is, there were many of us that really were very impressed with the Minnesota method, perhaps setting aside the cost of living adjustment portion of it, because it did have an incremental approach. It didn't have a cliff effect, and it appeared to take into consideration the more, it's not a straight line. It's an exponential approach, which seemed fairer at the time than the cross credit. And I'm interested because they have, we have a very sophisticated calculator. If we do an incremental approach, we're going to be able to have a calculator that will take care of whatever mathematical issues are there. So given that, and the fact that Minnesota, in conjunction with their incremental approach for parenting time, also discusses, they have a calculator for parenting time that feeds into their child support worksheet together. I'm just, I'd like a little bit of feedback about why Dr. Venohr, you seem not to like the Minnesota approach as much as some of us on the panel did.
Oh, I'm so sorry to give you that impression. I thank you for bringing that up. What I think is, Carol, thank you so much. What I'm looking for is where I have that mapped out. If you look at page 14, that's the Minnesota formula / Michigan formula. And for you all that are math nerds, if you look at that formula where it's A times to the cube times B minus B, A, so parent A versus parent B. And if you look at the top part, it looks exactly like a cross credit if you were to just simplify the math. And then you can see that there's either 3, it's 3 in Minnesota, Michigan uses 2.5. And what this does is it makes that adjustment nice and curved. And if you look at page 15, you'll see what Carol pointed out. And this is a concern, when you get into that math, that whole thing with, if you move from 50 to 52 overnights, is there a precipitous decrease? And you can see that these formulas are nice and smooth. So you look at the Minnesota formula, and it has that exponential, so that small subscript number 3. And then the Michigan formula is 2.5, that subscript. And you can see it makes a subtle little difference, but you're actually absolutely right that if your objective is to create like a smooth sort of gradual change from one parenting time arrangement to another, these formulas work really great. And it also shows Oregon. And the Oregon formula is on page 14. It's on toward the bottom. And you can see it's a really complicated math formula. And it was designed by a mathematician. It was actually designed to mimic the cross credit when you get to close to equal custody or equal physical custody. In Oregon had the cross credit, and they were like, oh, we don't really like that cliff effect once you get to that time sharing threshold, because when you use that cross credit with a multiplier, you have to have a time sharing threshold. With the Oregon and Michigan approach, you don't have to. But you look at that math on Oregon, and it's probably the most gradual. You look at it graphically on page 15, and there's a little bit, it looks like there's a little precipitous decrease right from 0 to 17. And that's actually just because I started it at 17 when I did the graph. I didn't want to make the graph really tight. So it's really an artifact of me, the way I did the graph in Excel. So it really doesn't have that precipitous decrease, but there's another, I thought I put it in here, but I might not. I've done the Oregon one compared to the cross credit. And the reason I compare the Oregon formula, a lot of states love the Oregon. When they go in the weeds, like the team did with the subcommittee that worked on this that Carol was referring to, they always invariably, they come out with like Oregon usually. Minnesota is pretty close, that they really like it. But it is very difficult to explain. I mean, and you can see from the math on page 14 on both of those formulas, it's a heavier formula to explain. Both Kentucky and Colorado tried to adopt the Oregon formula. It just died because it's more difficult to explain. I will say that Oregon took that formula and created a lookup table. And that lookup table is like 3 pages long. And what it does is exactly what Carol was saying, which is a huge benefit, is that, for 4 overnights, it might be 0.001 adjustment. For 6 overnights, it might be 0.0012. So it's such small increments that there's never, parents want to argue about one day over another day. it doesn't mathematically make that huge of a difference.
Yeah, and see, that's in my opinion, that's one of the things that makes this methodology more attractive, because it disincentivizes the arguing over 1 or 2 nights to get some benefit that you see on a cross credit. And when you also, if you can just logically, I didn't get it for a while when I started looking at this. And then all of a sudden it was like I had this, voila moment, because what it does is it does give a parent some recognition for what they're paying, but not, it doesn't overemphasize it, because it's a gradual implementation. I'm not I'm sorry, I'm not very articulate today. I was in the car for 4 hours to get here to sign in on this thing, but I will say this, I don't want us to discount this methodology just because it's a complicated mathematical formula, because I think there's a lot of very logical reasons why it may very well be the best in the long run, and the most easily explained once you understand the idea of the curve. And if you can get people over the hump of understanding the curve, then it makes ultimately good sense to do it this way. So,
Carol, if I may, I want to bring the committee up to speed, because Carol, you've been deep into this, and I think your points are valid, but I want to show them where the cross credit doesn't work. And so if we could look at page 7. And here's a case example. This was from an article I had in the Family Law Quarterly a couple of years ago. So it uses Illinois schedule, but it would be true with Georgia's table too. Is that we have equal incomes, and here it's at 25%. Like I say, if you use that cross credit with a multiplier, you have to have some sort of threshold. And here I'm using an example of 25% before you go to an adjustment. And you can see that there's this cliff effect that all of a sudden the parents get to 25%, and it's like, whoa, there's a huge adjustment. And so this is the thing that I believe Carol is saying, that no, this isn't going to work for Georgia because we don't want that cliff effect. Would that be fair, Carol?
Oh, yeah, I think it's very fair that we don't want the cliff effect, that we know states are getting away from the cliff effect. I mean, Tennessee was trying to get away from the cliff effect. Minnesota was trying to get away from the cliff effect. I mean, there seems to be a movement on to get away from the cliff effect. And so it just seems to me that we can also sell it from that perspective, which is that was causing people to argue. And here's a way where we can keep people from arguing over, whether I'm going to get 1 or 2 more days or 3 more days, because of the way that the calculation is done as it relates to the expenses. So I don't know, Judge Williford, if that sort of helps with some of your question that you had about the approach on these things, but I wanted to sort of jump in and just make the comment that the recommendations of the statutory of the committee, the subcommittee, we did kind of weigh all of these things out, and although we didn't come to consensus on everything, there were many things that we came to consensus on, and one of them was this very point. And so, whether statutory review or the commission itself is going to pay any attention to what we had to say, I have no idea. But at the same time, there was a pretty strong feeling, even amongst some people like myself, who had a very sort of kumbaya moment when I really came to understand how that particular approach worked.
I guess I would have 2 questions. One, and certainly I defer to the folks that worked on this for years, and put their blood and sweat and tears in it for hour after hour until they understood it. So the fact that Minnesota seemed to be a good approach to that group means everything to me. But I guess I have two questions. One, would it be as easy as we talked about before, where you would just go in, you would make whatever changes you need to do systematically, and then you would just go in and put in the days and it would work out the rest? It's not something where you've got to actually go in and change the basic child support obligation tables or anything like that. Okay. And then two, if it were, and this may be a stupid question because, the answer may be because the legislature can't understand it. I don't know. But if it works so much better and it avoids the cliff effect, it sounds like it's superior when you look at the graph to the cross credit with the multiplier. Why are only 3 states using it as opposed to 19 states who are using the cross credit?
Good
I think
question.
that's a very good question. And I think the cross credit, it makes sense. There's an intuition to it when you go line for line. And I mean, not to just the work of the committee, is that it is important to get an understanding, it was very hard on the Kentucky Commission. They worked very hard on it. And Pennsylvania did the same thing probably about 6 or 8 years ago. They decided on a formula that was started at very low levels of time sharing, like the Minnesota formula. And the commission was all on board on it. And then it goes to the legislature, in Pennsylvania's case, the Supreme Court. And they just said, no, we don't like it.
We don't understand the math, so no? Is that what
And
it
they
was?
also are really bothered by giving a time sharing adjustment to very low levels of time sharing. That was also a big issue, both in Colorado, in Kentucky, and in Pennsylvania. Is that for some reason, legislators do not, and who knows, I don't know the Georgia legislature. I don't want to speak, I can't speak for them. That might not be an issue for Georgia, but in Kentucky, no.
So if you use that nonlinear formula, would you be prohibited then from saying, and I guess I certainly don't understand the math. Let me start with that. But would you be prohibited then from saying the threshold starts at 25%? Or, would you be prohibited from doing that? Because you said, well, a lot of them didn't do it because they didn't want to give parenting time for those low levels. But could you not use the nonlinear formula but still have a threshold?
You could. You might have that same problem though, because if you do that, you're truncating it. So, like you can look at Exhibit 15, and let's say that you wanted to put a threshold at 20. And this is a case where I have equal income. If you were to use Oregon, which is the one that most states are favoring these days, although Colorado is liking Michigan. Michigan, sort of. I'll explain that in a minute. You're going to have a little bit of a cliff effect when you get a precipitous decrease. You can just see, you could draw a straight line and then you get to 20%, and then imagine just drawing a vertical line and it would drop. So you would still have that. And unfortunately, we don't have enough information on this. I'm still questioning the data that we're getting lately from states. I'm really questioning whether parents are totally motivated by money as far as when they're making their time sharing arrangements, or are they motivated by their schedule? I think for years we've mathematically obsessed about those cliff effects, but like what I'm hearing and seeing in the places where I have rich data right now is that it's lumpy. So I know there's parents out there that are negotiating based on time, I hear it, but are those the cases that we are hearing more because of our roles that we're in with reviewing the child support guidelines? I mean, that's something that you all on the ground know more so than me, particularly in Georgia. You know, I mean, some people are mellow, you know, I think in Michigan, it's not a mellow state. You know, and Oregon's a much more mellow state. You know, I don't know if you can say that about your caseloads in general, but that's something to think about. You know, I mean, there's a trade-off here, you know, obviously, and I'm really impressed that you guys figured that out very quickly, you know, within me being on the call for, you know, less than in this meeting, that there's a trade-off between keeping it simple and understandable and transparent and making that so there's no cliff sort of effect. But Colorado's actually talking about exactly what you're doing. Like on the last review, Colorado was saying they wanted to go with Oregon. The commission went with that. I wasn't involved. They took it to the legislature. It was killed. It was actually killed by the Bar Association. The Bar Association was anti doing that adjustment at very low levels. And so Colorado, and then they also, they were concerned about the automation, which isn't an issue in Georgia. And so they're rehashing it this year. And I'm surprised they're going with them. They're favoring the Minnesota, Michigan, but using a 2-point subscript. So you can imagine that Minnesota line and that Michigan line and just dropping it a little bit more in the distance. So they're thinking about going with 2.0, which won't be as generous of adjustment as Oregon. And then they're also thinking about maybe doing a threshold, you know, of like 20%, because they know that, you know, a lot of people don't like an adjustment for very low time sharing. So it's something that's an option. And again, I'm willing to graph out whatever, you know, when we get to that point. I mean, obviously we've got to narrow it down because, you know, you can't think of 100 different options, but we can certainly graph out, you know, 3 or 4 different options.
I have a question for our chairs. I mean, Dr. Venohr just took us very clearly through cross credit, and I even came to deeper understanding. And I know Carol and others have voiced, you know, talking about the pros of Minnesota. Could we stop and go thoroughly through what Minnesota means, just like what cross credit with 1.5% multiplier means? Is there time for that, or do you think there's value in that?
Well, I would love to see the formula, the way we saw it worked out for the cross credit. I say formula, the schedule, because that really helped me understand it. But I guess we don't have an exhibit like that for one where we have parent A, parent B, and how the nonlinear formula would work. Is that accurate?
That's your exhibit 4, Jane, that she's referencing.
I don't think I put one in here. I'm looking to see if I've got the provisions for Minnesota or Michigan. I don't, it's,
Well, let me ask you this, Jane. Carol seemed to say, can you explain why you don't seem to like this one? And you were like, oh, I'm sorry if it, you know, do you like this one? For Georgia? For Georgia. Do you like this one for Georgia?
I don't know yet. I'm listening yet to see how, I worried about complicated formulas for Georgia at this point, but I might be coming in with a wrong. I'm listening to hear what the committee says. I mean, if you read this memo, I put some weaknesses and the strengths of each of the formulas, and I feel my job is to tell you the strengths and weaknesses and to listen to what your concerns are and then help you kind of, everything's got trade-offs. I mean, and economists are trained at that. I didn't put a Michigan or the rules. I wish I would have. I'll get that for next time. But the way I remember their worksheet, it's a black hole.
Yeah.
that it's not stepped out all the way. It might be more so, it's not stepped out. Well, in Oregon, it's a lookup. I'll get you both the abbreviated version of the Oregon and the Minnesota time sharing adjustment. I won't do all of Oregon's, but that will help you see to make that comparison Exhibit 4. I think that's a good question.
And Jane, may I ask, are you thinking about are you going to update this document? Because this is draft.
Right.
So are you going to, the things you're mentioning that you're going to provide, are they going to get added to this document?
Or maybe just an addendum to it.
Yeah.
Addendum, I just,
Okay.
because these are public facing documents and we're under a short time fuse, I like to keep draft on it in case I did make any typos,
Okay. Sure.
Because and to our chairs, we're getting requests from the public for the documents. So that's going to be an issue. I would also like it. Well, it is dated. Never mind. It is dated. Just so we can see how you work, Jane, if you do an entirely separate document for our next meeting, or whether you change this, that'll affect how we publish it on the website.
Right. And I'll have to look at it again. I mean, I'd like to keep them as working drafts because it's important to keep feeding the subcommittee information. But
Right.
the last thing I want this to do is be taken out of context and for anybody to think that this is being proposed in Georgia, that this is for discussion purposes only. And maybe that's the way, instead of put draft, is to say for discussion purposes only, rather than to have somebody think that this is being recommended for Georgia.
Okay, well, we will work with you on that to make sure that the document reflects what you want it to reflect, so that what's posted on our website is appropriate from your standpoint.
Yeah, there probably needs to be a disclaimer somewhere on it.
Yeah.
So the nonlinear formula is something that the parenting time committee, who spent so much time on this, really apparently worked with and really liked. And as I understand it, one of the negatives or setbacks for this one would be that it's hard to explain the math. It's hard to explain the math, right? But I don't particularly, I guess I'm not the one training it. So let me just say that. But I don't particularly understand how any of the numbers are what the numbers are. For instance, this is how much it costs to raise 2 children if you make $7,000 a month. I don't have any idea how they came up with that number, and I don't care. That's the number. Okay. There's a formula. A bunch of smart people did it and they put it together, and this is how it works, And so I guess the calculator is going to do the math, right?
Right.
But y'all need, I guess what I'm hearing is that y'all need to be able to teach the math, teach the formula to show people for transparency reasons and so that people will understand the fairness of it. Is that what I'm hearing?
I would think so. To some degree, we would have to know exactly how as close as possible how it works, so that we can train it and answer questions.
Okay, so I'm gonna chime in here and say I agree, Elaine, that an explanation is appropriate, but I think the same explanation that I give my clients about, to Judge Williford's point about the BCSO table, I talk about the fact that the legislature hires economists to do this survey, and it gets updated every so many years, but I don't actually try and explain the math to them, whether I'm talking to a client or not. And I'll say this, after 3 years or whatever it was on the Parenting Time Deviation Study Committee, one thing that was clear is that we do not want to shy away from something complicated if it is superior. It is going to serve Georgia's parents and children best.
Yeah.
And I think Judge Williford's right. I think there are going to be people who, I think the majority of people are going to say, if you tell me to trust in this formula and that Georgia has put a lot of time and money into this calculator, I'm going to rely on it because I know that smart people with their area of expertise have done that. And to the extent that others need an explanation,
You're cutting out a little bit,
you
Katie.
know,
The computers do the math. The
subcommittee would
calculator's going to do the math.
Well, and I want to elaborate a
Well,
little bit further
do it when
about,
we have it. So I don't want
Katie, you're
Katie-
cutting in and out. You're cutting in and out. We're not really hearing you.
well, and I want to add to what Katie's concern is, because I get where she's coming from. And when I'm saying to explain the math, what we do today with the worksheet is explain that the gross income comes from Schedule A. It's on line 1. That's for both parents. It's added together. And then Schedule B is your adjustment to your gross income. And we'll explain to them, how do you see a difference from the first line to the second line because there was a pre-existing order, something of that nature. How do we get to the table? There's the pro rata shares, there's the BCSO, and then that gets divided, based on the pro rata shares. So we give them line by line understanding of where you put it in on a schedule, and it then comes over to the worksheet. That's the kind of explanation that Noelle and I would want to be able to say, not that we dig any deeper in the math. I'm sure that, maybe if someone wanted to get in the weeds about it, it would not be something we would do during the training.
Well,
Maybe they.
but I'm just saying, we don't have to teach people algebra and calculus. We just have
No.
to say,
Right.
here's.
How did the days, my overnights get on this form?
Right.
So we can explain, okay, you put all that information in and it came over and it's on this line, and you subtract from this or add to this or, whatever. That's the kind of explanation that we always do now, and we would want to continue to be able to do. Because
If
that
I
seems
may-
to satisfy most people, thank goodness.
Yeah, if I may, I'm smiling because I'm just very proud of you guys as a subcommittee that you're really having some opinions about what would be good or not for Georgia. And it's far more than I wanted to accomplish. I thought would get accomplished today. So thank you for the lively
Good.
discussion. I do want to really quickly, I see Carol's hands up, but I don't want to, we only have a few minutes left. So I'd be remiss if I didn't show you on page 8 some of these simple percentages, which is like the proposed Schedule C. And this is popular just because it's very simple, and then page 9 shows you that it results in these staircase effects, because once you go from one time range to a next time share range and get a different percentage, you get a decrease. So if we do think that parents are motivated by money, this is where you're going to get some parents that are negotiating to get to a higher decrease or a lower decrease, depending on, if they're the receiving or the paying parent. But if parents are just motivated by their time sharing schedule, this wouldn't be an issue. So I'm going to stop there because I interrupted Elaine. And
Oh, no, I was through, Jane. Thank you.
and I see Carol's hands up again.
It may be Carol's computer though.
Oh, okay.
I think she's having some, I don't know that Carol's actually raised.
Yeah, I'm actually here if you can hear me.
Carol, are you raising your hand?
Yeah, was raising my hand.
Okay, go
I just wanted to point out one thing between now and maybe the next meeting. The report that we did, there are a lot of appendices attached to that report that explain in much more detail kind of how all these formulas work. Maybe a little more simplistically than Dr. Venohr's, but might be helpful to take a look at. And there, I think, are some examples as well in some of the appendices. I think I think it's K, maybe, and a few others. So, that might be a place to go back and maybe look to and refresh to look at some of the things.
That's good.
Thank you.
Maybe I don't have to do case examples. Maybe they're already done.
Well, I'm not sure that you might want to go back and look through that and see what we did. Okay.
Yeah, I think we'll start with that report, and that would be a good place for this case examples, and then see if we need to supplement, particularly for any changes that have been made since then. And also since we have that case file data that the courts put together that shows what some of those incomes are like in parenting time cases.
All right, well, it is now 3:54, so I think we probably need to wrap up the discussion on with Dr. Venohr and wrap up anything else that we need to discuss or move from our agenda to next time's agenda, if this is a good stopping point for Dr. Venohr.
Okay.
All right, so Katie, sorry, I'm just going to jump in. The other things that are on the agenda for business of the subcommittee, Elaine, we just need to roll those over, and we may just have to continue to roll those over until we can get to them, because this work is so important
Right.
that
We
we're
will
doing
do
with
that.
Dr. Venohr, and some of that other stuff may just have to meet, wait for another time. Is there any other new business that we need to discuss? Right, it looks like our next meetings then that are already scheduled, correct me if I'm wrong, May 19th, is that the next meeting?
That's correct. May 19th, 2 p.m.
May 19th at 2 p.m. We have one scheduled for June the 23rd at 10 a.m. I'm assuming all this gets posted, right, Elaine?
It does. It's
Okay.
on the Child Support Commission website.
Okay, July 21st at 2 p.m., August 18th at 1:30 p.m., and September 21st at 10 a.m. And all of those meetings will be conducted in a Zoom webinar. So I think that I'm excited that we've got that many meetings scheduled out to work
I
on.
am too, because
very
thanks to
important work.
Jessica and Melissa, you just have great staff, Katie and Judge Williford, and they were amazing to work with on finding those dates. So I can't thank them enough.
Wonderful, wonderful. All right, well, with that, then I think I've got that it is 3:57. Why don't we adjourn the meeting, Katie, unless you have something else? And thank y'all so much for your time today. I can't imagine if we would have tried to also do low income deviation. So we didn't get nearly through with the parenting time report. So we're just going to have to keep plugging away and doing the best we can. Okay.
With all due respect, I was expecting 3 meetings with that time sharing adjustment. So you made more headways than I expected. So it's Friday afternoon, enjoy it. You deserve it.
All right. Thank y'all.
Thank
Have
you,
a good
Jane.
weekend. Thank you all for
Everybody.
attending.
Have a
Bye-bye.
great weekend.
Recording stopped.